Hi, I'm Erik Parker. I'm the pastor of Sherwood Park Lutheran Church here in Winnipeg. And I'm also a Doctor of Ministry student at the Saskatoon Theological Union. And today I am wanting to talk about decolonization. Decolonizing the church. What on earth are we talking about? Decolonization is a word that you may have heard before, especially in context here in Canada. It's a word that is often used in relation to our efforts for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It's a word that is used here in Winnipeg, and a word that is sometimes used by church folk to talk about decolonization in the context of our Christian faith. But the term might be a little bit confusing, and you might not know exactly what is meant by it. And so we begin by thinking that decolonization suggests that we are dropping something or undoing something. But what exactly is that thing? In order to really understand decolonization, we need to step back and consider colonization or colonialism and what exactly it means. Colonialism is another term that is complex and that carries a long, broad definition, includes a lot of things. There's many books that can be written about it. But ultimately, it's a term that is used to officially define the period from the late 15th century, late 1400s, around the time of Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue, to the early part of the 20th century. And during this period of 450 years, European powers use their resources to seek new powers and new lands and new resources, or more power, land, and resources beyond themselves in the world beyond Europe. In sending their armies along with missionaries of the church, they went to different places around the world, and there they conquered lands and imposed their culture and their beliefs on peoples, often destroying existing indigenous culture, beliefs, and languages in the process. This was also the time of the European Renaissance and Enlightenment, and which were two facets of European progress and advancement, which were ultimately built on the back of their increase in wealth and power through their colonization of various parts of the world. In particular, it's important to know that as Europeans looked southward towards Africa and westward towards the Americas, it was in the transatlantic slave trade that a lot of European power and wealth, and ultimately North American power and wealth, was created and developed. And finally, as a Lutheran, we also recognize that time period as one belonging to our own history in Martin Luther, who, I guess 25 years after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. And it was also not just Catholic churches, but Protestant churches who were often the missionaries sent by colonial powers to various parts of the world. And it was those missionaries who participated in the erasure or destruction of indigenous culture, language, and community. And so looking towards the South, the African slave trade towards the Americas, Europeans also turned their attention eastward towards Asia, to the Middle East, India, parts of Southeast Asia were also colonized. And so you can see through these images that I've been scrolling through, they're images of colonialism from around the world. And you can see European missionaries and soldiers finding their way to indigenous peoples and lands in the name of discovery, in the name of discovering parts of the world, which of course were well known to indigenous people long before Europeans ever arrived. And of course, here in Canada, we have our own history of colonization, which we are still contending with and dealing with today, and particularly in the last 100 years of residential school through the 20th century and the impacts of that on Indigenous people in our midst. And here you can see just how widespread coloniality or European colonization went. In the purple part of the map, those are regions where Christianity displaced existing local religions during the 16th to 20th centuries. In the green parts, you can see where Christianity was introduced but did not displace local indigenous religions. In the blue, you can see there's very little of the world that was not colonized by Europe. China, Mongolia, parts of the Middle East, and very small part of Africa. And then you can see in red and yellow the places that were already existing European Christian, part of the European Christian Empire from before this period. And so what happened? Once we got to the 20th century, particularly the time of the World Wars, European powers were already beginning to, at that time, step away from their colonial enterprises. It was difficult to maintain these vast empires beyond their own borders. And particularly as Europeans went to war with themselves in the First and Second World War, drawing in many parts of the world into global conflict, particularly in the Second World War, the colonial period, in a technical way, really came to an end. But from a church standpoint, looking at what came after colonialism, the technical colonialism, and lines of thinking that impact the way we understand the interaction between Eurocentricity, the primacy of European practice of religion and culture over indigenous and local cultures and religious practice. There are three strands of thinking that I want to introduce you to that contend with colonialism, but really coloniality, the legacies and structures of colonialism that remain. Liberation theology was a response to the reforms introduced by the Second Vatican Council in the early part of the 1960s. In Medina, Colombia, a conference was held involving theologians and Roman Catholic bishops, where they discussed the social structures that were oppressing so many of the people that they served in Latin America. And in particular, the idea that people's social circumstances, their poverty in particular, was something preordained and decided for them by God. And liberation theology rather took the opposite tact, that God did not want for people to be poor, to suffer, to be under the thumb of those in power, but rather sought the liberation of all peoples. And so liberation theology is often one of the catchphrases is God's preferential option for the poor, but in particular those on the bottom of society, God is seeking the liberation of. And we can hear echoes of this in Mary and the Magnificat, her song following the Annunciation, speaking about the ways in which God seeks to raise up the lowly. Liberation theology is also tied to Marxist political theory, which sort of is a theologizing of Karl Marx, and noting that the extreme versions of poverty, extreme versions of wealth are contrary to God's desire for human beings. So following liberation theology, there's a strand of thinking called post-colonialism. And this is a strand of thinking recognizing the impacts of colonialism, recognizing the impacts of the power structures of colonialism, and has been predominantly expressed through Asian thinkers, seeking to give voice and to hear the perspectives of those on the margins. And you can see in the pictures on the screen, book Edward Said, Orientalism, sort of naming this dynamic of culture. And his book was an important line of thinking for my own university education about 20 years ago. And post-colonialism is often about naming and articulating the impacts of coloniality that still exists today in the world. Following the strand of thinking of post-colonialism, we come to decolonization or decolonial thinking. Decolonial thinking is not just a theory or an analysis, but actually seeks to dismantle and deconstruct the structures of colonialism that exists in the real lives of the people, and lifts up the subversive along from the marginalized community, always interrogating claims to truth and authority. And decolonization can look different throughout the world. And we can see examples of decolonization thinking predominantly, again, in Latin America, although there is prominent decolonization thinkers in Africa and even in Canada, even at the Saskatoon Theological Union. And you can see decolonization is an issue that is present here in Canada and important for us as Canadians as we consider the ways in which we deconstruct the power structures that are present in our relationship as settler peoples to colonial or colonized Indigenous peoples. And so what does decolonization and Lutherans look like? Well, Lutheran Church was never the formal state church of main colonial powers. Those were the Roman Catholic, the Anglican, the Dutch Reformed, among others. Though there were some brief German and Scandinavian colonizing projects, the Lutherans have ultimately sort of been invited to join with other Europeans in their colonialist projects. And so in that sense, we have been a junior partner in the colonial project, particularly in North America. We were invited to add to the colonizing force of these colonial powers. I think of my grandfather, whose family arrived in North America, eventually to land in Bella Coola, a small community, indigenous community on the west coast of British Columbia, where a group of Norwegian settlers around the turn of the 20th century were looking for a place that looked like the fjords of Norway and found Bella Coola. And so there was a small community of Norwegians living alongside indigenous communities in British Columbia. Fast forward throughout the 20th century, and we arrive at sort of the turn of the 20th century, and the ELCIC in recent years has begun important work in recognizing our own complicity in colonialism, and we're beginning to dismantle the structures of the impact of those colonial realities, issuing statements on right relationships with Indigenous peoples, working towards dismantling structures of racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, which are all colonial power structures. But these are only first steps, and the continuing work of decolonization is the process of naming and uncovering all the places where a Eurocentric worldview, where a Eurocentric Christianity prevent us from seeing the ways in which we are still surrounded by coloniality, and the ways in which we could engage with others who fall outside of those Eurocentric worldviews and practice of Christianity. And finally, as Lutherans, we can look to the Lutheran World Federation's Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture, which is still today seen as a call to look beyond ourselves, to engage in intercultural relationships, to share and learn and grow across cultures rather than seeking to exploit and destroy through the imposition of a singular Eurocentric practice of religion and a Eurocentric power structures. And so this work of decolonization is just beginning in our midst, just a process that we have just hit the tip of the iceberg of, that will require a lot more work and a lot more integration with our full communion partners, as well as careful navigation and letting those colonized peoples, those on the margins, those who have been historically on the bottom of the power structures, to be the ones who now guide us and lead us through this process. So there you have it, decolonizing the church. What on earth are we talking about? Hopefully these things make more sense to you. And when you hear somebody use that term decolonizing, you might more understand what is being talked about. Thank you very much, and thanks for watching.